Oh, yeah, okay, thanks. Great. So yes, a global global move towards the strong man, one man rule in the post-Cold War era is the kind of key discussion point here. So unlike other authoritarian countries or regime where, of course, there is no free competitive election, so therefore citizens cannot choose any political leader. But in most of the autocratic leader, collective decision-making and ruling elites, including militaries, top ruling party officials, are able to hold leaders accountable. So therefore, generally collective decision-making, especially before Xi Jinping, China included, can be observed. But unlike this type of collective decision-making authoritarian regime, there are so-called personalist dictatorships where one single individual leader consolidated strong power, concentrated a lot of power into his own hands by purging potential rival elites, both in the security institution, but also ruling party. So generally only loyalists are in the inner circle. So no one can really threaten to punish, but also no one can really constrain leaders. So here it's basically individual leaders can decide whatever they want to do. So that's the kind of extreme sort of personalist dictatorships. So today, according to the global data, 40% or more of autocracies are actually ruled by so-called personalist dictatorships. So in the political science literature, so the consequence of such personalist dictatorships or the emergence of strongman is well known and studied because, as I just mentioned, ruling parties, ruling elites are not able to hold leaders accountable because they have lost the capacity to punish leader, remove leader. So without threat of removing punishment and accountability, these leaders become basically able to choose whatever they want to do, which means they can take greater risk in choosing any kind of policy than in autocracies where regime elites have potential accountability and punishment mechanism. So therefore, personalist dictators tend to be strongly associated with initiation of war, more belligerent behavior, more dangerous repression against the citizens. So there's no accountability coming from regime elites leads to more instability and especially initiation of war and more military conflict, instability in the world. So again, the consequence, especially this Putin strongman's behavior toward Russia is considered to be basically shaped by the fact that ruling elites in this regime are so weakened by Putin's regime Purges. So therefore, they can no longer really threaten to remove and punish and constrain Putin. Okay, so the consequence and effect of this kind of strongman emergence of personalist dictatorship is well discussed. But in the literature, surprisingly, very little is known how this emergence of strongman can be explained. So specifically, how can we explain why some leaders become strongman, consolidated enough power by repeatedly and systematically purging potentially strong rival elites from the top ranking position in the security and non-security institution. So that's the kind of big picture I want to tackle today. So the main kind of takeaway point, just very quickly, is that the conventional wisdom, even though I said there are not much studies in there, but generally in terms of the cause of strongman, people say leaders who start from position of strength vis-a-vis regime elite. So basically from the beginning, if they are very strong for various reasons, they can easily purge officers, they can easily eliminate people. So therefore they can easily consolidate power. So initial balance of power, the initially strong leader who come by strong strength vis-a-vis other regime elites are more likely to personalize the regime. On the other hand, leaders who start from a position of weakness are the least likely type to consolidate power through purges. So today, I won't make claim that that's not necessarily true. So we will discuss this more detailed, but generally idea here I want to propose is that leaders who come by institutionally, so therefore initially weak leaders, the leaders who start from a position of weakness vis-a-vis regime elites, are increasingly more likely to purge over time. So therefore, they eventually catch up, and in some cases surpass in terms of the frequency of purges compared to those people who start from position of strength. So the initial power balance doesn't necessarily indicate that only people who start from a position of strength consolidate power. Weak people always, commit to share power. I challenge that kind of distinct dominant idea in the literature. All right. So a specific question I would ask is that, all right, so how do you explain when and under what condition do leaders remove rival elites from the key position in the regime and expand power, consolidate power over time? More specifically, I will call this action as purges. What kind of autocrats purge high-ranking elites, but also when and why? So when can leaders purge? So purging is actually extremely costly in the short term for dictators because eliminating or dismissing strong elites, in particular strong military officers, can prompt backlash in the form of coup d'etat. There are many cases where a particular civilian elite leader tried to dismiss or demote strong military officers. It led immediate coup d'etat and successfully ousted the leader. So it's actually, when you do purges, you might think about the possibility that you might be removed immediately. So given the risk, so the couple of cases here, these are cases where I call backlash coup or preemptive coup caused by elites, leaders' attempt to purge and consolidate power. So given the high risk of a coup, and a successful coup means you lose power and being killed, you have to really minimize the risk of backlash coup. So that leads to the assertion that leaders are likely to purge or implement purge or initiate purge only when the actions are unlikely to prompt preemptive coup or backlash coup. So that is when leaders are unlikely to attempt a coup in response to purge, that's the only timing that leader can start purge. So when is that case? So to explain that, you have to think about coup d'etat. Attempting a coup is a collective action among military officers and civilian elites, in particular, both of them. So individual elites, including individual military officers, their decision whether to support and participate in a coup against the incumbent leader once being loyal to the status quo leader, it really depends on probability that how many people in your peers are likely to participate in a coup. So even if you want to support a coup, if you think that not enough people will support a coup, so therefore coup attempts will fail, then participating in a failed coup is a disaster. It's extremely costly. So they only, individual elites or military officers, only participate or support a coup only when they think that large segment of military or large segment of elite would support the coup. So that's the only time. On the other hand, if they think that most of the people are not going to attempt or participate in a coup being loyal to the dictator, they will stay silent, even if they want to replace the leader. So this expectation and belief, shared belief among elites that how many other people will actually go this side or the other side is the key. Yet, because of authoritarian nature and the secrecy and punishment repression, they're not going to talk about this issue. So that is generally this idea that how many people would actually take risk to support coup d'etat or take risk to defend leader. That kind of belief is information is unknown. It's very uncertain. So important thing for leader's point of view is that how can leader credibly demonstrate that they are very strong, they will be supported, leader will be supported by large segment of the military and civilian institution. So therefore, any kind of coup attempt would likely to be hard or would like to be fail. If they can demonstrate that convincingly, then they can also purge because there's no likely that it's very unlikely that purge will occur in response to Purges, coup d'etat, backlash coup will occur in response to purges because everyone knows that, purges is terrible for them, but they don't want to support a coup, which is likely to fail because everybody else is not going to support coup d'etat. So the key question, the start point of my theory is that, so how can leader actually demonstrate their strength, the support from strong elites, to the extent that they can deter coup? Specifically, they can deter backlash coup even after in response to purges. So if the backlash coup are unlikely to occur, that's a timing that they can purge. So, but how can leader demonstrate their strength, enabling them to implement purges? Okay. So the first part is, so there are two ways I will introduce how a leader can demonstrate their strengths, which in turn allow them to purge, implement, purge, and consolidate power. So there are two parts. So the first one, I will just go quickly because this part is already published, part of my publication already. So first one is that when leader actually come by coup d'etat by himself use the technology of coup, organized military, violent or unconstitutional way of removing the predecessor and coordinating action amongst large number of elites, in particular military officers, and successfully removing the leader and previous leader and coming to power. So that in itself is clear demonstration of power in the sense that he is the center of this action, that coordination among elites to actually oust the previous government. So that also means that he's supported by a group of strong elites who are willing to take risk and capable of executing this unconstitutional action. So, and everybody can see that, right? They see that when people come, military officers come to the capital, it's going to be like a common knowledge in the sense that everybody can assume everybody else saw it. So everybody has the idea that everybody see, came strong. No one wants to challenge that, right? So that kind of information making or belief making can be done by military action. So they can purge. So that means even if they purge, suddenly they start with people who are more connected to the previous government, but they eventually go into purging of their own group of supporting group who put him in power. But even in this case, because people all know that this leader is the focal point of coordinated action. So even within the seizure group or supporting group, they are unlikely to challenge leader. So again, so this is the timing that they can purge without risk of preemptive, causing backlash coup or preemptive coup. So they can purge at the beginning. However, this is again, it's a really demonstration effect, right? So successful coup event temporarily show the strength of leader and the group supporting group strength. But suddenly no one really believed that 5 years later that this same group of people are still willing to, believe this information and keep supporting leader. So the effect of demonstration, effect of coup entry will diminish over time. So that is leader who come by coup, via coup, make concentrated, extensive effort to eliminate enemies, purges within the state institution. Again, usually start with people who are connected to the predecessor, but eventually going into their own supporting group for the first few years. However, they will decreasing take such action over time as the demonstration effect of successful coup entry diminish. Just very quickly, so one of the examples is probably Nigeria's Abacha's case, who came to power, forcing out the predecessor in 1993. So upon coming to power, immediately he started to purge the loyalists to the previous leader, Babangida. So this is Babangida and Obote. But over the next, few years.
Jun, I'm sorry. May I ask you a clarifying question?
Yes.
When you say a purge, does it mean to eliminate the leader entirely from government, or it could be also a co-optation?
Oh, no. It's not co-optation. It's purges is a dismissing, demoting. Most of the time, coup d'etat, including after the coup, typically people arresting or jailing and these kind of things. But I don't count just shuffling, coming from one place to the another high-ranking Purges. Purges just going down, demoting or dismissing, but they might still be in the regime. Does that make sense? So you are excluded from the position going down, but I don't necessarily, I don't take the very exclusive approach of, some people think expulsion is the only way to call Purges, but we can discuss this. I call the kind of differentiation of specific actions, but that's probably enough here. Yeah. Thank you so much. So over the next few years, after he came to power, he, eliminated so many people, dismissed chief of staff of the army, dismissed interior office, the minister or interior minister, army chief. So these are people who are not necessarily about the connection to the previous government. These are all people who he himself assigned to these positions. So that is, those are people who are critical in putting him into power a few years ago. But he just kind of eliminated so many people. So that's the kind of one of the extensive purges that we can expect. All right. This is more sort of like new version than just kind of book selling points. So I want you to, I want to get any feedback as much as possible here. So the opposite side of these initially strong leaders who come to power by violence and caution, the opposite side of these leaders is so-called leaders who come to power through institutionalized selection process. So specifically what it means is that previous leaders or predecessor of these leaders are basically voluntarily step down, retire. So there is no forcing out or caution to remove the predecessor. They just step down and the new people came in a way that are consistent with the norm or explicit rules and the constitutional selection process that elites share. So they know that this is going to happen. And so this way of entry is generally doesn't allow new leader to take any kind of opportunistic action against the elites. This is because one is that compared to violent manner of entry, this type of institutional entry, as I said, they don't really use caution or force to oust the leader. So there's no sort of caution or violence demonstration opportunity for new leaders to come to power. Suddenly, they are selected through, supported by a large number of civilian elites in the process, but doesn't mean that they are willing to take risk to choose side if some kind of military coup or elite coup come to against the leader. So that is, institutional selection might reveal that large segment of elites supports the leader, new leader. It doesn't necessarily mean that it can't demonstrate that whether these people are willing to take risk and capable of defending leader in case coup d'etat or some kind of caution to remove leaders occur. And more importantly, in many cases, especially elites make decision collectively to choose leader, they tend to choose relatively easily replaceable leader, so weak leaders. For instance, this is Tajikistan's case when he's been in power for like 35 years, close to, just so I forgot to check the exact number. But when he was elected, Tajikistan's Rahman's case, he was really chosen as a compromising candidate. That he was chosen by other strong elites because he looked weak. He seemed to be easily replaceable. So therefore, no one wants to have extremely strong leader. If they can choose, they make compromise just to put someone relatively competent, but not necessarily strong. So therefore, they tend to be very weak vis-a-vis regime elite. That is, either cannot offend any strong elite who decided to put him in power. So that means they're unlikely to purge, least likely to take opportunistic action. So there are many cases where this type of leader decided to go against the strong elites, eliminate, purge, or dismiss, demote these people who selected you into power, that immediately backfire. So there are many cases where backlash coup is led by Purges initiated by these institutionally selected weak leader. So therefore, they are least likely to take purges at the beginning because they are facing strong elites, and their entry mode, the way they come to power, couldn't demonstrate credibly how likely that they can deter or fend off any kind of coercive attempt to remove leaders. However, I argue that this kind of dynamic will eventually change as leaders survive particularly difficult initial period of the first few years. So what it means is that, so first of all, the first few years, early years of leadership tenure tend to be associated with increased risk of threat coming from the outside of the regime. What it means is coming from outside of the regime, so like opposition group, rebel group, mass protest, foreign countries. This is because new leaders are, in general, have no experience as a leader. So therefore, this kind of inexperience makes them a good target. And also the uncertainty about how likely that these new leaders are willing to use force in order to kind of get the sense, infer the resolve of these new leaders. Foreign countries tend to use military action or make crisis to see how willing that new leaders are to use forces. So therefore, generally speaking, early years of tenure are extremely highly positively associated with the initiation, involvement of the occurrence of mass protest, rebel group, mass violence, but also the involvement of military and interstate war. In addition, so this part is threat coming from outside the regime is generally applicable to any kind of new leaders. But here, because these institutionally selected leaders are weak vis-a-vis regime elites, they also have to think that the way they handle these external threats can be judged by regime elites, stronger elites. And if they don't like the way they leader handles, they are also easily attempt a coup to remove the leader. So therefore, early years of tenure, surviving this period, not only they have to appropriately address external threat, but they have to do so in a way that strong regime elites think that he is competent enough, he can protect the regime, and so on and so on. Again, so unlike other leaders who come to power by coup, where elites cannot remove leader, here we are talking about initially weak leader. So elites have the ability, if they want to remove leader. So combining this insight, the fact that leaders can only survive early years if enough elites are happy about the leader's performance and indicated competence level. Because otherwise, they have an ability to punish and remove leaders. So therefore, if the leader has survived a particular period T, for instance, period T, that means that one is that individual elite individually evaluated the performance of leader, how they handle these crises or observable, unobservable crisis. But they also know by seeing the fact that they survive, let's say this month, that kind of update the belief of all the elites in a way that they know that all other elites, or a significant part of the elites, at least see them as competent enough, satisfactory enough, to the extent that no one really attempt a coup to remove leader. Again, here, assumption here is that elites are able to coordinate to remove leader if they see that leaders are not competent enough. So this only applies to weak institutionally selected leaders or women. So again, so once leaders survive, this means that they can allow all individual elites to update their belief about not only about leaders' competence, but what other elites are thinking about the competence of leader. So, and again, leader survival in itself is a observable event, shaping the common knowledge among all the elites. So that is, everyone knows leader survive. Maybe they disagree with the specific performance of leader in crisis management, but they all know the fact that they survive. That means compared to the place where they were still unknown that they would survive, they know that enough people are at least satisfactory about the competence of leader, because again, otherwise he would be removed. So that is kind of a shift that gives the belief among elite that compared to the very beginning of leadership, they are more certain that leaders are at least competent enough, but also large number segment of the elites are happy enough to the extent they didn't house leader. So gradually they change the belief in a way that everyone thinks that he's competent enough and everyone, all the elites are relatively happy. So gradually that will make it more difficult for any unsatisfied elite to attempt a coup, because it's less and less likely that that kind of attempt against leader will recruit enough number of people, because again, not only they think that performance is good, but they know that all other people at least see this is satisfactory enough. So that means that prevents enough people to come out to challenge leader. So that allow this kind of leader to gradually and increasingly purge without fear of preemptive or backlash coup over time. It is such an incremental and gradual process, but generally my hypothesis here is that institutionally selected leader, weak leader, is least likely to purge at the beginning, but they will increasingly purge rival elite as they stay in power longer. But again, the magnitude of the positive impact of time on purges would be the largest in the first few years of tenure, where the uncertainty about leaders' performance, competence, but also others' elites' belief are unknown. So once they, stay in power 10 years, they kind of know, okay, 1 more month of leader staying in power doesn't mean much. But at the beginning, just the first 6 years, 7 years, just surviving in itself will kind of updates the belief among leaders about leaders' strengths and other elites' preference. One of the examples, I think I just using too much time, so I'll just skip here. But Bashar al-Assad is one of the good case where obviously he's we know, well, now it's like civil war and everything, but we know that he was at least a very strong man at the end of the tenure. But when he came to power, although he was certainly a son of this big, strong man, his father, still he was seen very weak and very unexperienced because he studied as an eye doctor. So he has no experience. His older brother was kind of more competent one. Everyone's kind of felt like he was not really strong enough, competent enough to survive in power. But precisely because of this weakness, vulnerability of this Bashar, strong elites in the old guard who supported his dad, his father, were willing to support him because he was not really charismatic and strong, so he can easily be replaceable, but also manageable by the old guard. But yet this kind of perception changed as he survived this post 9/11 environment security institution where Bush and the US really verbally, but action-wise, started attacking Syria as a terrorist supporting country. So I'm sorry, I'm just going to skip this, but just generally by going through this process, elites change the perception about how competent, how decent, how capable these Bashars are, which makes it more likely that Bashar could start purging oligarch or the elite in the old elite without prompting any kind of backlash attempt. All right, so sorry, just kind of it took really long, but the big point which I want to tell in this book is this. So there are two types of leaders who start from violence and very strong, and the other one is initially weak leader who start as selected as institutionally selected leader. So this is my part. So initially, strong leader is much higher likelihood of purges at the beginning, extensive purges, but as the demonstration effects diminish, they would go down. So this is the y-axis is the ability to purge or probability of purge opportunistic action. On the other hand, initially weak institutional leaders are significantly less likely to purge at the beginning, but I expect that as they survive, show the competence over time, they will increasing, okay? So you might think like, okay, so what? But so this is quite contrast, like different from alternative argument, established literature's argument. So that most of the literature doesn't really see any dynamic process, temporal pattern. They see as kind of any kind of leader doesn't really change the ability to purge over time. So in this type of literature, generally, initially strong leaders purge always much, constantly, but much significantly higher ratio compared to initially weak leader. People who care more about kind of dynamic process, they generally say purges or attempt to consolidate power happen at the very beginning. But again, as you can see, this parallel patterns or parallel line can suggest that either way, literature argues that initially strong leaders always have advantage, permanent advantage to purge or consolidate power. So initially leaders might be purge, but they always significantly less likely to purge, so they will never catch up. So that leads to the argument that the dominant argument that leaders who come by institutionally seen as weak leaders are the least likely type to become a strongman because they can't purge, never. So I will challenge this argument. Okay, so very quickly, so the big part of this project selling point is really a new data set on military purges and security institutional purges. So I will use just generally time series cross-sectional with leader year as a unit of analysis, only autocracy 1980 to 2010 because that's the coverage of my new data. So in terms of, again, purge data, so I'm kind of going back to your point. So purges here, I conceptualize in a way, I can conceptualize as leader's action to remove potential rival from high-ranking position in the state apparatus. So it could be security, but also ruling parties or cabinet and everything. But also I called that action to remove the resources and personnel and the institution position themselves also as a purges because the source of a purge as position and personnel to control is all gone. So kind of a more sort of comprehensive way to measure purges. So this purge data itself is a lot of things are coded. It's an event data. It's either violent purges or the way that leaders of purges are coded, dismissing, expulsion, part of reshuffling, but demotion, which position were purged, general size of purges, and to background reason whether what's the kind of suspected motivation by leaders. So yeah, here, so each leader, so this is the leader and first year, tenure, just to kind of plot the variation in to just show how this purge data looks like. So as you can see, it's clearly some kind of time variation, just to rather than constant leader. So this is a more violent purges much less frequently to occur.
What was the? Sorry, the color. I missed that.
Yeah, no, this is I'm using binary purge variable, but this one is I just kind of combined in a way that darker the color. I think it's includes both violent purges and large scale purges, and lower just one yeah, sorry, I didn't explain that. But there's a nuanced coding here. Okay, so but that said, for main analysis, I use just one big purge variable, aggregated purge variable, which include, which is coded as one, if leader year observation experienced one of these things. One, leader dismiss, demote, expel, arrest, execute at least one individual from a high-ranking position within the state apparatus. So we can discuss in more detail, but generally high-ranking position is includes all the central committee members as already high. We can differentiate point of view on that, but generally that, and cabinet membership, cabinet equivalent position, army chief and staff. So generally high-ranking position, at least one people are dismissed, that's included. Also, leaders disband or dissolve at least one institution, organization, or position itself, then it is also coded. So sometimes they just kind of disband one particular ministry, or division of army that is led by, controlled by rival elites. So leader dismiss, demote to 10 individual, that means not the high ranking position, but below that, but I see as a sort of group is entirely gone as Purges. I will discuss it if you want in the Q&A, but there are different ways to operationalize Purges for a robustness check. All right, so explanatory variable, as I said, the key is really the way leader come to power. So I coded 3 different type of leader entry. So coup entry, as we discussed, so the leader when come by leading military coup. I say military, it doesn't have to be actual military, but unconstitutional overt action, which typically means that actually the officers have to use, come to the capital. So therefore it's military coup. Institutional selection entry is the way predecessor leader wasn't ousted or forced out, and a new leader come to power according to the way the institutional role will define. And between them, there's a non-coup irregular entry. So it's not coup, but they use violence and caution. So I skipped that part because that would make the theory too long. But as you can imagine, this is going to be the medium size of demonstration effect. Like civil war, you can buy civil war, mass protest. So they use caution. So they use kind of show that support how strong your supporting groups are. So they can sort of defend from coup. But because they didn't actually organize coup, the deterrence effect is lower. So the probability of Purge is medium for this. And I control a good number of things. Main model is just a simple logic model, plus the robust standard error with country. Also another mixed logic model with leader intercept as a random variable. As a robustness, also linear probability model with 2-way fixed effect with country and year. Generally, the results are pretty consistent. All right. Okay, so the temporal dynamic of Purges. So this is a predicted probability estimated by my model. As you can see, left side, this is a coup d'etat entry leader. So consistent with my hypothesis, when leader come by coup, Purge occurs the highest, like a lot of coup occur, Purge occur, but as they stay in power longer, as the demonstration effect of entry diminish, the probability of Purges diminish. And then other irregular entry leader, non-coup coercive violence entry. So this is basically insignificant effect of time, but generally it's kind of like a bit higher, but basically it shows demonstration, but it's not much. So it also doesn't really, demonstration effect doesn't lose much because they didn't exist at the beginning. All right, but most important part here is that when leader come by institutionally selected leader, consistent with the idea that they are very least likely to purge because they are weak, they can't offend elite. But as they stay in power, they really significantly more likely to purge over time. So this clear contrasting sort of dynamic of purge pattern is really consistent with my idea, but also it's clearly challenged the predominant idea in the literature. So this is more just as a way to show this contrasting effect of time. So it's a average marginal effect of tenure. So marginal effect of leader surviving 1 more year on probability of purges. So consistent with the argument for coup leader, this part is a negative impact of time. Because as you stay in power, they decrease in purges. For institutional entry leader, time has clear positive significant impact on average. So on average, you increase 0.01 probability of purges as you survive 1 more year. On the other hand, this is the medium part, right? So this is also, it's similar to coup leader. It's negative, but it's not much. So it's basically insignificant. So final part, this is the end. So the part that we were discussing is really effect of time on individual leaders' purges. But what we want to know is that over time comparison among different entry leaders, right? So one of the leaders start really strong, but going down, but the other one was starting weak, but going up. Over time, what's the difference kind of generally? So this is the difference between coup leader and institutional entry leader in the left side. So I plot the average marginal effect of entry manner. So at the beginning, coup entry leaders significantly more likely to purge than institutional entry leader. However, their disadvantage significantly diminish over time. And I mean, obviously it's a really long-term scale, but in 15 years, it's completely insignificant. And if you stay really long, generally institutional entry leaders become more and more likely to purge than coup entry leaders. Similar pattern can be seen between other irregular entry leader and institutional leader. So finally, this is just to kind of ignore the time difference, but by looking at the one leader's tenure, entire leader who stay in power more than 10 years, so relatively long surviving leader. I use the count model, a negative binomial model, to see which type of entry leader has the largest number of purges conducted during tenure total. So I don't show the actual statistical analysis. Generally, institutionally entry leader, assuming that they stay in power more than 10 years, they are the most likely type to purge, largest number of purge per leader. So if you stay in 10 years, leaders who stay compared, institutional leaders are most likely to purge compared to coercive entry leader is a coup or non-coup. But when you look at the civilian elite purges, this difference is quite clear, significant difference that institutional entry leaders are the highest number of purges per leader. Military purges, it is certainly show that coup leaders are the highest, but this difference is not statistically significant. So that at least you can say that even looking at military purges, violent entry leader who start from a strength doesn't necessarily have clear advantage or permanent advantage in making attempt to consolidate power. So yeah, just kind of to summarize, one of the contributions of this paper is that we take time seriously. So generally when they do purges or strongman, they really don't actually, it's kind of weird because it's clearly over time sort of a process, temporal process, but they usually see more about sort of time constant approach or time invariant approach. So one of the very influential work, Annie's Meng's work, which I like, but it's also cross-sectional research design, even though they look at whether personalist regime occur or not. And as I show, the multiple paths toward strongman, there's not only one. So that means that leaders who start from a position of weakness eventually can catch up, and compared to those people who start from position of strength. But the bigger point really is that initial balance of power or initial advantage of a particular leader over the other doesn't determine whether this particular leader are likely to become strongman or not. Rather, it really defines and shapes the process, time trajectory, over time trajectory of how they get to that stage. Right. So yeah, so that's kind of one of the biggest takeaway from this. Right, thank you so much. Sorry, I just spent too much time, but thank you so much.
Super fascinating. And congratulations on
Submit.
All right, we will start with a graduate student, Gustavo. So we'll start here and I will keep it cute.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Actually, I have two questions, one methodologic and one about your presentation.
Can't hear.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Oh, okay. So, okay. In your presentation, I was wondering how the results would change if you consider people who came to power through institutional entry, if we consider external manipulations. You know, I mean,
Foreign imposition.
Yeah. Foreign. I mean, for example, about Assad's, who, I mean, it was weak, but there were some other external affairs that led him to be in power. And the second question is that, I mean, about your method. You use, I mean, time series analysis.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Should I?
Yeah, go for it. Sorry.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. So the question is the foreign imposition, or if the foreign country supported to put new leaders in power. So I include that in the other irregular entry leader, so just the kind of mid category, because one is that, as you said, the foreign country obviously show, capability wise is much stronger than any elites, but at the same time, it's very unlikely that they keep supporting, staying there forever. So this kind of uncertainty about whether they can keep supporting, use military action for new leader is uncertain. So I categorize this in the second as a non-coup irregular entry, in a way that if you actually organize a coup, you show the supporting group, but compared to that, foreign imposition is a weak effect in demonstrating deterrence effect. So therefore, they are less likely to purge compared to coup leader, but they are more likely to purge than institutional leader. But that said, this part is that this is the aggregated category. I can't just have 10 different entry leaders, right? So that is various people's opinion. I took various people's opinion to just kind of categorize the only three. But yeah, you are right though. But if you look at the more specific of disaggregates the, as a non-coup irregular entry category, I see that there are different kind of argument can be made. I just can't do that in this book, yeah. But thank you.
Gustavo.
Okay, very super interesting research agenda. It's more than a paper, this, I think. So my first question is about the notion of a purge. Okay, so because just to think about, I have a point of reference. No, in every democracy, a new government comes, and essentially the whole cabinet is purged. No. So there is a full change. No, in a parliamentary system, when a party the government falls, a new government form, and essentially the whole cabinet will be different. No, so essentially, especially for the initial ones, I think we really need to distinguish what is a purge versus what is a standard dismissal of somebody serving at the pleasure of the executive, because these are very, very different things. Okay.
Yeah.
So the second thing is it's a question about the weak autocrats. Why don't the elites put a term limit? So they start weak. They are facing the risk that this guy will be becoming stronger, and then it may come from comes for you. Why don't put it a term limit, and that would work as a focal point for a rebellion if the term limit is not respected, and then they always have a weak leader if that's what they want. So essentially, it looks like the elites. So there is something missing here on why the elites cannot impose a term limit and keep these autocrat weak forever.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the time limits argument is, Xi Jinping withdrew it. So it's whether time limit in itself is so most of the institutional entity leader coded in my data, not most, but many of them actually have time limit, and I control it. But the basically time limit doesn't really constrain that's the thing. So whether time limit has impact on diminishing or constraining leader. So there's a literature on it, and people have different opinion depending on the coding of time limit. But yeah, so I guess that leads to the kind of big question of what other institutional constraint. So what do you mean by institutional entry vis-a-vis other kind of institutional constraint? So here I kind of skipped the argument to just control these time limits and everything. But generally, even if there's a time limit, my argument is that so very rare. But if the time limit is what do you call this? It withdrew.
Binding.
Yeah, or annulled. I don't know.
Annulled, yeah.
Annulled.
Right, annulled, right. It's annulled. It's coded as a kind of disbanding of institution. It's sort of part of Purges, but it's very rare. It's very rare. So over time they can. So yeah. So the first question is the key of my Purge data. So so there are a couple of things I want to say. So I coded, so that's right. Oh, sorry. This old one, sorry. So here, so you are extremely right, right? So even democracy, I mean, suddenly democratic leader can purge, right? And then so that conceptually, first of all, purging is there. So the sources of power, the source of power for any individual elite is, especially in autocracy, is having a high-ranking position, because obviously you can access to political decision-making process, but they can control subordinate, they can access to the wealth and spoil associated with the position, but having this position, they can empower themselves. So keeping anyone, even if it's non-loyal, it's very loyal people, but keeping them in a really long time in a high-ranking position itself is dangerous for dictator. So that's what I think that current military purges in China, who basically protege of Xi Jinping in the military top position, was just ousted. But there are many reasons why to think, but some people say because he showed the disloyalty, but some people say, no, he's been really loyal. Again, just kind of keeping the position, even if he is very loyal in itself, is dangerous. So therefore, they should purge. But that said, so what I want to say is, like, it's very difficult so in the background reason coding, I coded that each case is what's the background reason or motivation for leader to purge, looking at the existing literature's account, the news sources, and various things. So there's a way to code that, okay, leader purges because these elites are seen as a threat. One, because they are competent, two, popular among elites, or these elites previously criticized the leader, or three, the leader have rumor that elites actually attempting a coup or threatening to challenge the authority. So it's clear that this purges, it's so-called political purges, clearly is targeting elites. But the difficulty is that most of the time, leader use corruption charges. So it's like, oh, they are corrupted. So it's not political purges to expand power. Rather, I want to clean up, system in a kind of good faith. Should we call these corruption charge purges as a purges? So it's essentially, it's coming back to like how we incentive or motivation behind purges, leaders purges, should be the necessary component for some event as purges or not. So that's I say, I don't think so. I think we shouldn't, but some people say, no, we should. So therefore, basically, as a robustness check, I use the variable of purges where I include only, So I call rival purges, and there's one more political purges. So looking at the coded reason behind purges, which indicate incentive motivation behind purges by leader, I only include the end where it's clear that the intention of leader to weaken the rival and expand their own power is very clear. So that's much more kind of closer to what you mentioned, that not just simple reshuffling or simple automatic non-political technical dismissal is not included in this variable. So it's all basically similar. That's a much smaller number, the result the same. Another way I think that to counter or sort of fight, just to defend my position from that critique, is that I also include violent top purges. So arresting or jailing or killing of top high-ranking officers, that's the only one to be coded as purges. So that is, although we don't know what's the intention behind it, but still arresting and jailing top opposition. And in addition to combining the reason behind it, I think it's capture very clear, obvious case of political purges that rather than just the general dismissing that we observe in democracies.
Could we just
Really quick.
But I think my concern is at the beginning, because it's like you are taking over a new regime. So I think it's like you are just removing key positions from that regime and then filling with your own people. And would you consider that a purge or just the initial of a...
No, the new formation of cabinet is not included.
Okay.
Right. But still, the institutional leaders are the least likely to purge. Oh, you're talking about the coup leader action.
Well, the institutional leaders, I thought that they were purging a lot, no? So
the least likely at the beginning, they're least likely.
Oh, at the beginning, but overall.
Yeah. So it doesn't. Even if I counted, that would go against the So institutional leaders are least likely to purge. So this doesn't count the cabinet formation, but even if included, it's kind of stressing my argument. Yeah.
Claudia, and then Mike, and then Natasha, and then Patricia.
Thank you, Jun. I'm impressed by your data collection and research project. Impressive. Probably I am confused. When you started collecting the data, are you counting those based on, because I think that there is probably survivalship bias. How do you differentiate between those weak leaders that didn't make it and those weak leaders that did make it? Because otherwise it seems that we are selecting based on the dependent variable, So we are not comparing those potential weak leaders that could have made it. And also I think that probably the type or the mode of entry is contingent and party system. And I don't see how the party system is here involved. Usually the literature says that dominant party systems are the ones who usually tend to entry weak leaders that they can stay forever. So is this contingent on the nature of the party system? Also, is this contingent on institutions? Because why? You were offering many examples, but as you were talking, I was thinking all the time about the Venezuelan case. Well, Chavez came to power and he stay. Maduro came to power and he stay. And all the time there were elections, but institutions were not working as they were supposed to be working. So I don't know, I feel like there is a missing part over there, how to put all this together. It's based on party system, it's based on weak institution, it was what? And how was the selection of these cases? Because otherwise we are selecting at the dependent variable.
Yeah, I hope I understand that. So that I guess your idea is that some of the variation in the ruling party system can potentially lead to, so that usually, as you said, ruling party is institution to constrain leaders, so therefore less likely to purges. But you are saying that are we controlling the strength of ruling parties? So yeah, so I control whether it's inherited parties. So that is Gettysburg's argument, where they basically say that if the leader comes by, through the inherited ruling party, they are constrained. On the other hand, leaders who create their own party, they can do whatever they want to do. So even if there's a both party system, the founding party leaders are likely to purge. On the other hand, inherited ruling parties leaders shouldn't purge. So I show, I don't have the slides here, but I show that even if you not only control, but look at those people who selected through institutionalized system, but with inherited party and founding party, I show the same kind of temporal pattern. So that is kind of another argument, but that's the variation in the strength of party in itself doesn't really affect the result. But yes, I understand what you're saying about that. Certainly you have to control, which I control. And certainly there's a huge variation in terms of inherited or founding party. But in this paper, empirically, I think I took into account that. So the first one, I'm not sure I understand, but I think you mean like a did make it? It means like staying long power. Yeah. So that is a very important question. So just kind of reinterpret what you said. I think the biggest concern, or when you look at the over time or temporal trajectory, is really that rather than estimating the impact of time on particular leader, we are kind of looking at the composition of different type of leader and how they change over time. So what it means is, as you said, at the beginning, a lot of weak leaders who can't even survive 2 years, a lot of them are here. So regardless of the entries or whatever, they don't purge, but we see like probability of purge very low because there are so many weak leaders. But over time, only strong leaders survive. So therefore, so that can potentially mean that there's no temporal dynamic as I expect for institutional leader, but rather there actually purges are constant But at the beginning, we see low probability because there are just so many weak leaders who can't even purge and survive. So there are two ways to address that. At least I took into account that comment in a two-way. One is that just basically I re-examine this analysis using only the sample people who survive enough. So starting from dropping people who didn't survive more than 2 years to people who survived more than 10 years. So these are kind of group of strong leader. But even looking at these long-term, long surviving, potentially really strong leader, I can see institutionally selected leaders are very weak. At the beginning, they don't purge, and they eventually go over. Coup leader or similarly. So that means it's not really about the change in the composition of type of leader. The fact that at the beginning, so many weak leaders who doesn't survive diminish the risk of purges. I don't think that is driving my result. The second approach I did is this, so the easiest way to control the way leader come to power and then personal tendency variation of their leader's strengths and all, probably fixed effect is the easiest one, technically. But the fixed effect of leader level will drop the entry mode variable. So I can't really test what I need to test. So instead, I did a random mixed effect random model to sort of incorporate the variation in individual leaders, regardless of the way leader come. But individual leaders are different in terms of their propensity to purges. So that is already taken into account in the model. I also did in a robustness check, two-way fixed effect with a country. It's not leader, but it can sort of take into account the difference in unobserved variation in countries. Sorry, yeah.
Okay, we have a long, awesome list here. So Mike, and then Natasha, and then Patricia. And we have several after that.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. This was a fascinating talk, but I've been sitting here trying to get a sense of what's the underlying process logic that you have for being in power. And I think it's basically, it's not easy to stay in power, an authoritarian leader. It's just not easy. And I've always kind of had a lot of respect for dictators who are able to stay in power because they got a tough life. They're trying to balance the other powerful people in the country, and they're trying to, balance the possibility of overthrow from unrest and stuff like that. And I think what you've demonstrated clearly is this policy tool of purging is something that turns out to be useful, no matter how you got into power. Okay, and it's useful. It's a useful policy tool. And you're even almost getting the sense there where whether you start with a coup or an institutional one, you kind of end up with, pretty much use it as there's almost an equilibrium level of using purge. But then that leads me to think, well, what are the other tools these desperate leaders are using to try and stay in power beyond the purges? Okay, and that's where your definition of purge comes in is important, because if you define purge too widely, then sort of everything's a purge. If you define it too narrowly, then so. But what are the other sort of options that you think these leaders are using that's affecting how likely they are to go with a purge?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So the generally some motivation, but the co-optation so the opposite of purges or expanding power at the expense of regime elites is to share power. So credibly commit to share power. So credibly, I give you this position forever. Not only to you, but just collectively, I am not going to, start purging on other people. So usually, people who focus more on this power sharing aspect is, as you mentioned, that, various institutionalizations, is that the leader himself decided to, let's do the term limit so that I can credibly commit, so that you are not going to suddenly become suspicious about my move to kill me. I will commit to you. So the other type of research are actually exactly what you said, focus more on how leader can credibly commit so that they don't, make elites suspicious that would lead to accidental coup. right?
Mhm.
But that approach is obviously costly because they have to keep sharing power. So they will never control the regime decision making. And then some people probably ask that so why do they even want to purge, or what kind of people want to even expand power? As you said, that would be potentially backlash coup, why don't you use the other way to stay in power long? But the issue is that one is that, it's a suspicious world that, even if you credibly try to commit, people misunderstand that one way. But I think to me is that expanding power is the core of this party, is to diminish actual elite's ability to collectively punish leader. So sharing power is opposite, right? So you give more power, you give more position and staying there for a long time, then you accumulate loyalty from the people on the below, subordinate, interacting everybody peer every day, so they can coordinate better. That eventually makes them more stronger. Elites become stronger to credibly threaten to punish. So even though they might actually not attempt a coup, but basically leader always have to be constrained because the threat. So basically sharing power allow you to stay in power a long time, but that means they are implicitly or explicitly increasing their elite's ability to threaten to oust the leader. So it's completely different. So some people are actually looking only at the leader's survival or the attempt of a coup as whether power sharing is successful or not. But it can go both ways. But inside, it's really about potential ability that elites can successfully organize a coup, which is how credibly they can force leader to do what they want to do. And leader's point of view, they just want to get rid of that eventually. Yeah.
Okay, Natasha and then Patricia.
I just wanted to say this is probably one of my favorite presentations I've seen at the workshop.
Thank you.
Interesting. My question is related to Maddie's question. I think Syria is a really difficult case study for this. I think even in the comparison of Hafez, who it sounds like you describe as starting out from a position of power and then can insulate himself, and then Bashar inherits that power and kind of uses that to propel himself toward a solidification. I think in the track of Bashar taking power, there was never a time in which he had endogenous power in and of himself. It was always externalized. And like you could see that when he was basically going to be deposed before Russia intervened, right? Like that could have happened a decade ago, except his power then became entirely reliant on, Russia, Iran, Hezbollah. And that enforcement became his fleet and being. It was not his own Praetorian Guard. It wasn't the Alawi community or, the inherited charisma of his father. It was, in my opinion, entirely external. And people from his Praetorian Guard, did not want to contest him or defect, even though there was a very credible opposition force that they probably could have found a way into. And so I feel like that case study almost like completely inverts what you say, because his power decreased.
Yeah.
And he had no opportunity to purge. There were some purges, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
But it wasn't like purge and then more power, purge and then more power. It was like, no, I need this guard and I need to insulate myself because my only credibility is inherited credibility.
And also Islamic regime of Iran.
Sorry?
Islamic Republic regime of Iran.
I said it wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, I think my argument is definitely not definitely applicable to the later part of period of Bashar. I'm really looking at the first, maximum 10 years in terms of this case study. So he came to power, on just a political inexperienceness, and his kind of like no charisma, no experience, and all the experts said he's just not going to survive, and old guard would easily replace him. But so again, starting from very weak, and the first 5 years, my case studies was actually first 5 years he couldn't do anything. That's the point. But then around 6 years, around where Bush so much attack, but for various, so it's not necessarily because of his competence, but just various ways he somehow survived and then the regime survived in this post 9/11s. Then this kind of perception among elites, but more generally foreign counterparts, experts' view toward Bashar really shifted around there, what's that, 2005, like maybe it's the Congress in the 6th year, before the 7th year of his tenure, really big purges to just exclude the oligarch, then replacing them with his family member. And then 2 years later, he actually replaced his own brother to someone else, and just only just that. So I'm definitely I'm not saying that this entire period is explained by my theory. I'm just using it to explain why so weak leader 6-7 years later, I just started gradually doing it. So it's not necessarily a very strong case, to be honest, but it's definitely captured the essence of first few years. So, but I agree with you about the longer term non-applicability. Yes.
Hello, thank you for a very interesting and novel presentation. Found it very, very interesting. I have 2 questions. One very quick and straightforward in terms of research design. I think you mentioned the unit of analysis is the time, this
Leader year.
What are the rest of the variables you use? Popularity, Purge, who, electoral process? That wasn't very clear to me.
Yeah. So sure. So the leader year, so the main explanatory variable, the way leader come to power, institution and stuff. The control variable, it's like 150 pages of appendix. I did a lot of control, but generally, right, institutions, the ruling parties, inherited parties, or founding parties, whether it's coup d'etat, but some people come by non-coup military regime or military, not military regime, actually it's not military regime, whether leader is actually military officers or had military experience, and just the general kind of thing. Economy, failed coup obviously leads to purges, so you have to control various crises. And also tons of institutions like term limits or how many terms you have and that kind of thing.
And in terms of content, this is the different question. What do you mean by, you were talking about the leaders this type of leaders who get to power through a legitimate process, let's say an electoral process.
Right.
You said that one of the things they do once they feel a little bit more comfortable is to get rid of an institution. What exactly do you mean by getting rid of an institution? I'm thinking,
Okay.
closing a branch, like those who like to say, I dissolved the Congress versus reforming one, because in my personal experience, reforming an institution can be equally or more dangerous than getting rid of one. You may have here, I remember the Venezuelan case, I want a new constitution to have a better Congress or a better judicial branch, but when you call for a new constitution, you also may be calling for the change of the institutional rules of the society.
Yeah. Right. So the institution here is really it's either the place where allows these high-ranking position people to regularly communicate, and so therefore more likely to coordinate against leader. So that is like committee or like parties like something committees or something meeting. But most important, just most of the cases coded in these categories actually is really that the branch of the military organization controlled by some rival elites. So like Syria's case, not the Bashar, Hafez al-Assad's brother, uncle, like who threatened to, Hafez al-Assad's brother, his old brother, who basically attempted a coup against his brother. After that, the strongest military division controlled by this brother was basically disbanded or merged with the much bigger organization. So that kind of things, or ministries or clothes ministry that was run by other rival elites were closed, and also I include also complete disclosure of legislature are also included. So I actually have to be more careful. This is something I have to think more carefully. Yeah, thank you.
Eduardo, and then I have a couple online.
just sharing a thought here that when you're talking, remind me that that's not only a feature of countries, but it's a process that you find, maybe in political parties, in corporations, and a lot of other situations where you see this trajectory of, autocratic leaders. So that's what I was thinking, if you had a kind of maybe think about a broader framework, for autocratic leadership. And I mean, this is very particular, of course, to dynamics of country level. But it reminded me of so many other examples.
Yeah. Also, you mean like, so not just only Purges, but the
Yeah.
cooptation and.
In general.
Yeah.
Political
That's
parties, organized crime, we see a lot of that similar trajectories within organized crime. Yeah. So there are lots of parallels, I think, that,
Oh, can follow this.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you.
I can too under that, because it then makes me think about like differentiating or thinking about how your theory, right, because it could apply so much beyond just the country perspective, is similar to or divergent from the straight up logic of political survival.
Yeah.
Right? It's really for authoritarians, right? But like, what are you pushing against BDM squared S squared way, right? What is that look like? Because there's a lot in here that, right, their conversation has also been used to think about how you stay in power.
Yeah.
Right? Similar questions of loyalty when you lose power,
Right.
etc.
So just to, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but like, so selected theory is really this. This is selected theory. So selected theory, also they don't really differentiate who is what, but we generally say that they're more kind of focusing on incentive to purges. So in their case, purges is weak, minimizing the weakening, what's the W basically, or they actually say purges are removing people from this winning coalition and so on. They have actually a couple of papers they call purges, and we cite each other and all that. But so their argument is basically only focusing on incentive when they want to do it. They want to purge at the beginning because for them, what's the purge is basically individual with low affirmity is replaced by high affirmity people. That is basically similar to loyalty. So it's like when you look at like anyone in the winning coalition at the very beginning, who are the most disloyal and loyal, and just kick out the disloyal one and put the loyal one. That is their purges at the beginning that occur, but that doesn't really take into account the ability aspect in the sense that if you kick out the disloyal strong one, backlash could immediately occur. So their argument really doesn't include anything about backlash part means no ability. So it's, so the incentive argument is that BDM, but more civil military relation. And people who focus more on ability, Garrett's book or Meng's book, they only focus more sort of like smear. Yeah, so their mind is here. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna, do you feel like you? Okay,
That's good.
Okay, I've got a couple online that I'm going to, and then Paolo. Okay, so just online, HS is a great question. And this also builds a little bit on what Edu was saying. Feels like this talk even explains authoritarian tendencies in more populist democracies, which ends up in certain ways blurring the boundaries between elite purges and authoritarian and democratic regimes. Do you think your theory extends to the populist regimes, and he's referencing India and US, for example, who might have regular transfers of power and constitutional guardrails to avoid elite purges? That's the first question online. I'm just giving you the second one, maybe take them both, and then we'll come back to the room. The second one is from Alfonso, and it is, are there any economic or resource considerations incorporated in any way regarding your study of purges?
Yeah, just to adjust question, I think that also part of, which is also in line with what Patricia mentioned, is we're seeing, in democracy that are elected a growing trend in these authoritarian ways. And I think that definitely purges are an important means for staying in power, but it's the massive violations of human rights what really makes a dictatorship. So yes, no sympathy for no dictators, for even the ones that you elect and keep in power, because part of their survival, if we want to think about political survival, depends on these massive forms of violence. Many of us here in the room are survivors of directly or indirectly. So it's interesting, that this touches many of our lives as well.
Can I just add on top of that, because I wanted to ask about social movement. It's not like in forms of protest, but very informal, like influence of the civil society that keep track of even the institutional entry of the leader. And in some minor countries, like my country is just a small minor one, can be labeled as authoritarian, but cannot be like in the case of China, where they can fix the manned term constitution in order to stay in power. And Purges happen is not in terms of military political way, because of the influence of the civil society. So that role of the civil society is for me is important, and here the focus is like about the leader and the elite, and I don't see the people in the picture of study.
Okay, so it sounds like we have questions about extending this to democracies, particularly populist democracies, but even more generally. And then we have a question about economic and resource considerations, right? Let's take those, and then we have 5 minutes left. So we have Paolo and Chewy. I don't know if that was your question. So Paolo, and then we have yours, and then we'll wrap up. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So if you want to take those two, the extending democracy, and then
very quickly. So I mean, it's a couple of different ways to interpret the question, but in general, so I don't incorporate the people aspect or position party aspect in this regime, because so there are two ways that the authoritarian comparative literature developed. Many people are primarily focused more like probably 80% of people focus more on the regime, how the regime handle opposition group, also its repression literature, right? So that's something I teach in general. But so when the regime authoritarian becomes so violent, it's hard. But more recent work just showed that if you actually want to explain the outcome, the choice of policies of dictatorship, you really have to focus on leader-elite relationship, because who is domestic key audience in autocracy, that is ruling elites, and then punishing by coup, which is the ultimate way to constrain leader. So that's the symbolic sort of change the dynamic in the literature. So in terms of the actual how impacts for this public opinion or population here. So in the theory, it's for institutional leaders, right? So it's the way leader survive this, moves through this crisis. That's the way elites kind of infer the competence level of leader, because they have to protect their own interest within the regime. And that's how I actually include, but I don't, you are right. You are right. I don't really include, people's perspective, because it's not important. It's just that it's just the power dynamics within the regime. It's the kind of key to explain why leader become more strongman, which in turn explain why they become more repressive. So to explain why the regime becomes so repressive toward other people, some people say, well, that's because it can't really constrain leader. So that's what I am kind of like focusing on. That's the reason. In terms of the popular authoritarian, the logic applies to democracy, and maybe Trump and people ask, and I would think so generally, the way that generally, by surviving a difficult initial period, people kind of make a decision about how competent leaders are. So therefore, become more confident about leaders, even in democracy. So all the people think that, no one wants to go against Trump compared to previous year, because people know that everybody else know how, not competent, but how, strong he is and so on. So this logic probably applies. But that said, I to be honest, I don't know, because I don't know what's the exact kind of constraint that Congress could have. So that's a different literature, in my opinion. But the general logic probably should apply. I guess that's that. And somebody said economy, but I don't really include the economic part, sorry.
Wonderful. Last two questions here and then there, and then
Okay,
closing remarks.
thank you so much for showing us your investigation. It's very interesting, like the control and geo, court decision, economic control, and geographic control. The elite and large companies have significant decision-making power in the selection of these leaders. I have a question about this. How does digital technology play a role in our research? What do you think about this? Like some leaders use like platform like social media for control anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a really interesting question.
Sorry.
So yeah.
Final
Oh, yeah,
question.
so, sure. No, I get that. Thank you. No, thank you.
Hi, I'm Nahian. I'm
Yeah.
a graduate student from O'Neill. So pleasure to be in this room. The question I wanted to ask is, you mentioned about institutionally weak leaders. So the question, and they sort of show less purges in cases. However, like what would happen if, let's say, a leader comes into power through democratic process, which we saw in Sri Lanka and then Bangladesh as well. They came into power through democratic practices. They won the supermajority and then came into power. And then within almost 2 years, they showed autocratic tendencies where there were enforced disappearances of opposition leader, where there were killings within movements as well. So would those be considered as purges as a whole? And then also relating to that not all sort of institutionally empowered leaders, they don't necessarily show the democratic tendencies. They more lean towards authoritarian perspectives. Is that something you've looked at, or?
Yeah, so that I guess like the democratic countries are selected by actually competitive fair election, which typically coded as actual democracy, but then eventually become authoritarian countries by repressing violently using people or shut down the Congress. So these are sort of like autocratization or emergence of autocracy. So in this particular case, I include this manner of entry, which autocratization entry included in this, second category, non-coup coercive violence, because the way they change the system shows sort of caution to change democratic way of system. So they can sort of show the way that they can handle coup d'etat. So that means they can more likely to purge compared to institutional leader. But so that's how I include in these kind of cases in the data and the theory. In terms of I think the second point you mentioned, which is important, is so there's coercive entry and initial purge potentially overlapped phenomena. So tautological, we are calling the same thing as purges and violent entry. So to do that, I set the specific date. So this is the entry, it's a clear 7 days has passed. Then after that, we count any kind of action toward elites as purges. So there's no let's say overlap or conflation of the same event as coded as sort of autocratization entry as well as purges, which kind of overestimates the ability effective purges. But so that's how I change. But you said something about repression. So the civilians and outside the regime, like opposition parties or people who don't have access to the regime security or institution position are, if they are targeted, it's no purges. I'm looking at only regime elite purges. That is just leader elite accountability that can potentially explain why the regime repressed people, but repression are not included in this data. Yeah, so I don't know what you said about that. That I'm not sure how this actually affect it. I think it's certainly AI and the social media affects the way opposition parties or opposition groups coordinate action to making protest. Certainly that would impact the way the regime see how threatening these are. But I don't know whether it's an interesting question to think that, because I'm looking at intra-elite politics. whether there's communication and coordination, which is really the key in power dynamics in the regime, that is shaped by the social media. I don't know. I think this is really, actually, it's a really interesting question. It's just difficult to get the data. So I don't see much of the literature on this, but I think that's a really interesting question. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanking.
Oh, thanks.